We are now joined by one of the demonstrators. Maya Menezes is a Canadian climate activist, member of the Canadian Youth Delegation here at the UN Climate Talks, Senior Manager of Development at climate justice organization The Leap, a migrant rights organizer with No One is Illegal. It's great to have you with us. Describe for us what you're seeing right now, right behind you, Maya.
Well, we've got a really incredible coalition of climate activists from across the global south, but also their allies in the global north, who are calling for the decorporatization of the COP and for a climate justice movement that centers people, not polluters.
And what does that mean? And are you concerned about what's come out of these talks, though they're continuing until tomorrow? What are you demanding has to happen?
I think we're demanding that we want to see people's rights and protection for marginalized peoples at the core of how we have these climate discussions, which we know just never happens. It's not in the interests of wealthy corporate elites to make sure that marginalized people's voices are heard, and that's why community organizers have to mobilize in the way that we do to ensure that that message reaches the public. And that's what we were calling for today.
According to some projections, 1/5 of the world's population in 2100, that's 2 billion people, could become climate refugees. That's by the end of the century. Have you in Climate Talks here addressed the staggering number that we're talking about? You are particularly focused on migrants, and what does climate migrants mean?
These talks never have that discussion at the core of them. In fact, a lot of the ways that we talk about migrant and refugee issues actually uses language that makes it very easy for right-wing extremism to navigate the space in a way where we start to call people and we refer to them as illegals. A lot of the conversations around migrants and refugees center things like regular migration, safe migration, and it allows a lot of space for that language suddenly to be used to call people illegal, irregular crossings. And that's what I organized against in Toronto. Right now we're seeing, of course, a lot of people on the move with the migrant caravan, waiting, many people who have applied for asylum in the United States, many people whose claims will be denied. A lot of the organizing that we do when we leave the COP spaces and when we go home is fight for things like the Safe Third Country Agreement to be rescinded in Canada. The Safe Third Country Agreement is basically a piece of law that bars people who have applied for asylum in the US and been denied access to apply for asylum in Canada. Migrant rights activists have been calling in Canada for this to be rescinded for a very long time. It basically says that the US is a safe country. We know that the US has rampant xenophobia, and that this will actually serve to bar people who are in the migrant caravan from being able to get access to Canada. And that's something we want to see removed immediately.
We just reported in our headlines about the 7-year-old Guatemalan girl who came over the border with her dad. She has just died of dehydration and shock. We just learned this while in the custody of U.S. Border Patrol. They didn't take her to the hospital until her temperature peaked over 105 degrees. This treatment of migrants and what this bodes for the future, and where you think the kind of activism you're involved in can play a role?
I think we actually need to invest in organizers who are fighting this idea that migrants and refugees are seen as dangerous in our society. It's a very, very frightening common theme that we're seeing across the COP and that we're seeing at home. This language that has allowed people, I guess actually a story is when we found out about the caging of migrant children and the removal from their families in the US, there was of course international days of action where people occupied outside of US consulates calling for this end. When I was going through the crowd afterwards, I spoke at that rally, and when I was going through the crowd later talking to parents who were there with their children, who were saying, you know, I said, why are you here? What draws you here? We know these children are being traumatized, they're being treated so inhumanely, and we need an end to detentions and we need an end to deportations. And many family members who were there said, well, I don't actually believe that people shouldn't be imprisoned. I just think families should be in jail together. And that's a very scary thing. It's a very scary thing to be faced with. So what we're trying to organize on the ground against is actually a rejection that some people are deserving of basic dignity and rights and some are not. In the global climate crisis, we understand that most of the world either will be turned into a desert or will be uninhabitable due to the temperatures, storm changes. We need to make sure that a climate plan that talks about decreasing emissions also has an open conversation that the borders must be open and people must have clear avenues to status and citizenship and safety in wherever they want to move to.
Can you quickly talk about the Canadian role right here at the UN talks? One of your representatives, her event was just disrupted.
Yes, definitely. Well, Canada has an interesting role. We're touted as a very progressive government, and at the same time, we push some of the harshest refugee and migrant laws out there. Right now, we're talking about, there was an event, of course, that we heard about between, I think it was Claire Perry and Catherine McKenna was on that panel as well.
And explain who they are.
Claire Perry, I believe, is the UK Environment Minister. Catherine McKenna is the Canadian Minister of Environment and Climate Change. And it was a conversation about getting off coal, which is all fine and great. But the Canadian government right now, 80% of oil and gas emissions, largely coming out of the tar sands, are going to be exempt from the federal carbon pricing plan, which is outrageous. That's a complete oxymoron to say that we care about the climate and reducing emissions, but then exempting 80% of oil and gas from that carbon pricing plan. And so the role of Canada is interesting in that regard, but we're here to basically call out domestic policies that are completely out of sync with what Canada says on the international stage, from migration and refugee issues to carbon emissions plans that don't hold polluters accountable at all.
The United Nations formally recognized climate migration for the first time this week, with more than 160 nations agreeing to the United Nations Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration at a meeting in Marrakesh, Morocco. The compact asks nations to, quote, provide basic services for migrants, whether they enter a country legally or illegally, and facilitate access to procedures for family reunification for migrants at all skill levels, and establish mechanisms for the portability of Social Security entitlements, unquote. The United States did not sign on to the agreement. In a statement, the U.S. State Department said the United States proclaims and reaffirms its belief that decisions about how to secure its borders and whom to admit for legal residency or to grant citizenship are among the most important sovereign decisions the state can make and are not subject to negotiation. Maya, your thoughts?
I think something that really bothers me about all of this language is when countries, and of course the context for me being Canada, when countries like us sign on to these agreements, I think that's fantastic in a lot of different ways. But also we have domestic policies that completely fly in the face of it. In Canada, for example, with the Safe Third Country Agreement, we know that people who are applying for asylum in the migrant caravan, many of whom have come from Central and South America, are on the move not because of tsunamis, but because of war and destabilization. We know that Canada supported the coup in Honduras in 2009 in order to continue Canadian mining practices and to expand their reach. We know that the many Hondurans that are in the migrant caravan who have applied for asylum in the United States are not going to be able to apply for asylum in Canada because of the Safe Third Country Agreement. This is war and mining profiteering that Canada is championing in Central and South America. And then, of course, when these people are on the move because of political destabilization, we deny them at the border. And this is a climate issue, and it's not taken up in these documents the way that it should be, and it's not taken up by the Canadian government the way they need to be accountable for it.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Maya Menezes, Canadian climate activist, member of the Canadian Youth Delegation here at the UN Climate Talks, Senior Manager of Development at climate justice organization The Leap, also a migrant rights organizer with No One Is Illegal. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. As we broadcast from the UN Climate Talks in Poland, we turn now to look at a UK-based movement taking extreme action to fight the climate crisis. It's called Extinction Rebellion. Its members have been supergluing themselves to government buildings, shutting down roads, taking to the streets to sound the alarm about the impending catastrophe of global warming. Extinction Rebellion marched here in Katowice last Saturday to protest UN climate talks. In November, Extinction Rebellion protesters shut down London bridges, blockaded the UK Department for Business and Energy, and attempted to interrupt Brexit negotiations.
Conscientious protection. This is what it looks We're very concerned about the state the Earth is in, the seriousness of things. You know, we're leading towards 3 degrees centigrade. Well, that's way outside the range that human development is known. Enormous unknown dangers.
Tell the truth, everybody needs to know what's coming. We need to know what's coming. Everybody needs to know. You need to wake up.
The highway, please.
I only got arrested for the first time 2 days ago, and now I'm doing it again. So basically you become disobedient towards the system as a result of our impending danger.
The government is criminally complacent in the mass murder of all life on this planet, and I will not be silent.
Those are members of Extinction Rebellion, a movement taking radical action to combat the climate crisis. It started in the United Kingdom just 6 months ago, is now spread to at least 35 countries. Extinction Rebellion's demanding governments commit to legally binding measures to slash consumption, reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025. We're joined right now by Extinction Rebellion activist Liam Gary Balch. He just participated in the action here at the UN Climate Summit, not far from the Democracy Now! Set. It's great to have you with us, Liam. You know, even using words like global warming or climate change, people feel does not convey the urgency of this issue. You all have decided to use the term extinction. Extinction Rebellion is your group. Talk about what you're doing.
So we've been talking to people about the real science that we're seeing now, not in an alarmist way, but in a realistic way. We are now facing what could be the next mass extinction. We're already grieving over the lives lost, both human and otherwise, to climate change. And we're seeing and talking to people about the fact that we might now be facing human extinction. And so we're asking people to face that grief and feel that emotional response to this crisis, what we're calling an emergency crisis. We want to shift the language to that emergency crisis and to respond to that and move through that into action.
So explain your actions. It's just been 6 months since you guys got started. What have you done in the UK?
So we just actually did our first action just a month and a half ago. We gathered outside of the UK Parliament and we declared a rebellion against the government. This is not a one-off protest or direct action against a specific corporation. This is an ongoing rebellion against our government in the UK over their inaction on climate change. So we lay down in the road and other people read out the Declaration of Rebellion, and then we said, we're here, we're going to keep rebelling, and I was arrested that day and taken away.
You were arrested?
Yeah.
And what happened?
And then we were released. Most of our activists have been released so far. They're aware that part of our movement is the fact that we have hundreds, if not thousands now, people willing to get arrested for this cause, willing to give up their freedom about this issue because the time for action is now, and we're calling on our government to tell the truth.
Supergluing yourselves? Explain what you did.
Yeah, so we shut down the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy a week later, and that led to a whole series of actions where people were risking arrest. We saw that activists decided to shut down this department for 6 hours by supergluing themselves to the doors, and that's the department that's having backroom meetings with fracking companies while refusing to go and meet the people who have to live next door to where they're trying to frack in the UK.
You shut down 5 bridges. How?
So we've just seen an amazing response from that month and a half ago original action. Our campaign has just exploded. We now have a reach of 100,000 people. We're in over 35 countries around the world, and 6,000 people came out on the street on the 17th of November and blocked 5 bridges in central London. We had trained affinity groups in non-violent civil disobedience to take those bridges initially, and then members of the public in their thousands took to the streets and sat in the roads and celebrated our resistance against this system. People are angry and they're calling for a change to the system. I think that's what we've been seeing in the action going on behind us here. That's what we're seeing in movements like the Sunrise Movement and the school strikes. This is being reflected all across the world right now.
In fact, today is the school strike globally that Greta Thunberg has called for. And we're going to hear from Polish high school students who made it to the COP today, who walked out of school. How would you assess, this is your fourth COP, Conference of Parties, your fourth UN Climate Summit. Do you think it has succeeded? Do you think it's failing?
I am aware that this system is broken. The political system in the UK is broken. The political system here at the COP is broken. We're asking for a citizens' assembly to be formed, a whole new system which can solve this crisis without the politicians kind of continuing to talk to each other. I'm here at COP to talk to activists on the ground, to learn from each other across grassroots movements around the world. And we're here to talk with those people about how they can join us next year on the 15th of April when we declare an international rebellion.
I want to thank you very much, Liam Geary-Balch, activist with the new organization based in Britain but spreading around the globe, Extinction Rebellion. You're planning a week-long rebellion, April 15th?
Yeah, and we hope to see you there, and we hope to see your viewers there. Please find your local groups, get involved, get trained in non-violent civil disobedience, and take part in the Extinction Rebellion.
We urge you to continue to watch Democracy Now! As we are there not only in the streets but in the suites and at these UN climate summits, as well as the gatherings that are taking place all over the world. Stay with us.